second on that. And the second thing I'll do is share the screen, because if somebody actually watches this, that is quite useful for them. But the thing to connect with this is that there are many stylistics of making rules. I'm jumping a bit downwards. It's somewhere here-ish, like maybe visible. No, well, you'll find it after the link. You can see the link. So after the link, there is a part of stylistics of rules. And while it's many, I think there was one thing I wanted to highlight there, which is that there are rules that are defined for predictability and system enforcement. So, for example, if Amazon in their logistics make a rule for their people that they can only have 5-minute toilet breaks and no coffee breaks, this is actually rules towards like creating a more efficient machine. Like the whole system in itself is a machine, and people are merely cogs in the machine. And what these rules is to create more predictability to their behavior, and therefore make a more predictable machine, like how fast it functions and how clear the time schedules can be, and so on. And of course, a lot of design in the traditional sense is this sort of enforcement. A lot of law is also like designed with that kind of mindset. But then there's also rules that are created for generativity and emergence. Not emergency, but things emerging. So, so if you think of a rule in Go, the board game, like there are very simple rules, but the rules are designed precisely to create this situation that is unpredictable. Like you can predict certain things about it. That's part of why the game is how it is. But it's also like it's really essentially impossible to predict where the game will go, and that's kind of the point of the rules, is to create this new space from the play. And while both are rules, they create very different things. And it's completely possible to create towards generativity and emergence, which can potentially include the topic you raised, Linda, also like evolution. Maybe the rules generate rules as well. That's a completely valid direction that some games like Nomic use. But like together, these two things, like that the rule is limiting, yes, but it's also enabling, and it can be designed as enablement in mind, like the right to free speech is designed with an enablement in mind. It's a good example of that. And then the rules can be about predicting and trying to make everybody function in a manner that we know exactly how the system functions, like say industrial organization from the 1920s style of thing, or Amazon, which is kind of the same thing. But the rules can also be designed in this, like, let's use these rules to end up in a place that we cannot predict, that is new for all of us. And this is a key, whether it's thinking about a game, whether it's thinking about an organization, whether it's thinking about an economy as well. And it also kind of covers something that puts the rules in a different kind of perspective that many people, especially when I talk to art side, it's often like when you start talking about rules, they only think about the kind of enforcement side of things and the limiting side of things. Like, oh, you're bringing rules. We like to have no rules at all. And then, well, that's a rule in itself to say we have a rule of no rules. But often the missing part is not seeing that the rule could be made in order that we find a new behavior, and not because we follow the rule without question in itself. So that's, I think, useful communication for a person who might not have like a, let's say, like this sort of advanced game designing way of looking at rules.
It's funny that you mentioned sort of the art side of having no rules, which is very true, no? Claiming of having no rules, but that also to me equals with actually not really being organized. Like there's the the fact that there's no cohesive art scene, is all, you know, art market and then grassroots. So with no rules, obviously in an utopian world where we all agree, then we won't need any rule. But actually rules are essential in any sort of organizing. So I find it quite, you know, this dream of having no rules as if it was something instead of,
Yeah.
From the literary kind of perspective, it's also interesting that people are very used. Some people, let's say Jorge Luis Borges or Jos Perec, or someone who writes in rhymes, poetry or something like that, in meter. People are very used to use this sort of like not limiting rules that are more like constraints. Then there are like conceptual artists who use both in literary and music and visual arts, that who use kind of this sort of like methods in that language, or so on, procedures maybe. So every time you repeat something, it becomes the same output, and this also can be seen, but in a different way, as both like enabling and restricting. But it is really interesting. One other thing is like that. Okay, when we have rules, do they, or how many different sets of rules do we have, or are they like totally unlimited, let's say object-bound rules, in a way kind of that they ain't like governed from top, but from the bottom, or from kind of so everyone has their own like genetics, and are the rules more like on the infrastructure level, kind of platform level, or are they just like limiting, applying for a certain space under on top of this like infrastructure that is open? So you may have like more closed systems and rules if you so desire. Let's say a movie, a film is a very closed kind of set of rules. You have the time that is very forcing and so on, usually, but like what do you have under it? Is it then enabling you to create what you want and so on?
Yeah, that in itself, like there is a section under the stylistic which says like ecosystem of rule like forms, and like once there is this sort of understanding of rules, then it's good to look at like actually, well, laws of course are like rules in itself, like, but they behave in a certain kind of manner, like they emphasize the enforcement, but then principles is another. Then rules has kind of conventionally understand rules, but then also conventions, like we tend to behave this way, or I expect this from you, like you might behave differently, but this is the kind of expectation range. Yeah, and even tendencies themselves. And then going from there, like things like, well, there is a rule likeness to things like obstacles, like a physical environment or a game environment, that that there is a wall you cannot walk through. And like it has this sort of sense of actuality, in the sense of mentioned earlier, that you have to play with this actuality, that the field is now like this and there is an object in front of you. So it forms this sort of family, but I do think all of this family kind of reflects these qualities that we're talking about, like the kind of limiting and enabling, and then that they could be there if it's a designed environment towards predictability and for emergence. And also, like, predictability and emergence is not a positive negative kind of thing. It's like sometimes in a game you create predictability to make the game to be like it is in itself. But also, like the one thing to add to this is, like, looking at it this way often creates this sort of interesting analytics. Like, just to point out an example of organizations, if one thinks about like an organization in a fairly traditional sense, like, oh, you are a member and I am a member, and then oh, you have because you're a member, you have the right to propose and vote, or things like this. All of those come with their own like limiting, binding, while enabling. Like if I say you are a member, it also means that I'm respecting that you are a member. I'm behaving towards you as you are a member. Otherwise, the organization does not exist. And when we go to these proposals, we all behave in the manner that proposals kind of function, how they function, and then you get a vote if there is the rule of voting upon them, and so on and so forth. So it's a constant interplay between these two limiting and enabling factors. So that's also one example of how this reflects in all of these forms in different ways. But Pablo, Rock, any comments from you? Like, I will swear to also fast forward at some point. Like, but I think these are kind of potentially kind of useful foundations for things to come. But so it's useful to use time for them. But we can fast forward if things get too bogged down into these topics.
I'm doing a diagram in the board. Maybe you can look at it below the that section.
Oh, okay. That's a very good exercise.
Yeah, maybe it's interesting to sort of like map the different types of rules. I don't know if the strict loose axis, maybe I don't like that much. The restricting enabling for sure. The other one I'm not so sure, but yeah, maybe this is useful.
I think it's useful, like, and the strict and loose could be also soft and hard. Like
Yeah.
maybe strict hard slash hard, loose slash soft, because then I think you might be thinking, like, I know my thought on the soft and hard, but your strict and loose might be slightly different and therefore valuable in terms of like what kind of perspective it creates.
I guess I'm thinking enforcement, but not sure like if that's a useful axis, because then we have to talk about who enforces those rules, which I do believe it's important. Like in the case of the rules that are enabling, right? Like you mentioned Amazon strict bathroom breaks.
Yes.
Of course, that enables Amazon efficiency at the cost of quality of life of workers, right? So maybe enforcement opens up the world of power. That interesting question.
Actually, yeah, definitely I won't kind of mix that up because you are actually thinking of a really interesting direction, which kind of could be mentioned elsewhere and is not really there, which is like actually like because the organizations, well, games as well and economies as well, but the organizations make it very visible that they're kind of entities themselves. Like in a way, they form this group entities. Like there is the concept of egregore that could be fitting here, which is a kind of when a group of people form a thing that has sort of a mind of its own, like a company. That's an egregore. And how you put it is like showing that in a way, like actually the Amazon might be thinking the rights of the egregore of Amazon when kind of controlling its workers, which creates this interesting nesting, I think, which is very real, but for many people kind of could be weird to start off. But if you start thinking about it, it kind of makes sense that actually we treat often these organizational bodies like as bodies of their own, and many of the things are about the rights of them, often with the reasoning that it's about the efficiency of a company and it's for the good of everybody. Same for nations. Nations often explain that it's good for the nation, and which is then supposed to be good for everybody. But like, I think it's a more constructive or designed way of thinking about it. It's actually towards the rights of the entity that is the nation, and then it's about how that entity is supposed to behave because it now has these rights or powers or skills, these kind of things. So it's a very fertile direction you're pushing towards there.
I also think that I think this is great. Just a few questions, like I think it is very easy to understand this, like hard, soft, strict, loose, because on the other end you have mathematics, and you have making science, this sort of like natural science and so on, and on the other end you have like culture and this sort of like human behavior. But then again, like I'm just thinking that can you say that something is or how can you say what is if you have a restriction, is it more enabling, or is it more kind of restricting? Of course, you can actually do it by asking people. You have to do it this sort of like way to look into kind of what sort of experiences now I actually kind of people have. Now I actually get it, because it's also a matter of imagination and learning learning how to use the procedure wrong in order to make something strange about it or so. But yeah, this was just like me.
No, that's a very interesting direction. I'm sorry, my camera, as usual, is going up and down, which it does sometimes, but you already know that. But yeah, like that kind of direction. Hopefully, you're also making notes, because you're kind of opening up certain things that are kind of there, but also like the things you're taking on are also new directions, and for me, like what I mean, of course, it's kind of very initiatory, because it's trying to explain this route of like, okay, how do you come into this cohesive thinking that is actually where it's almost natural that you think games and organizations and economies in the same way, and what kind of, like, how do you update the existing concepts, like here rules, and that leads you there, but then that opens up new kinds of thinking, which you're like both doing, I think, which is in itself highly interesting. But one comment on this, Mikael, you kind of were working already in an interesting direction, but this question of how do you know how it's enabling and how it's limiting, how much? I think the starting point is that it's always both. Like in some way, it's always both. Like even in the most strict rules, there's some enablement, but then it's really about kind of looking at almost the rule as an expression. It's like if it's there, like what does it kind of open up for you to do? Like how are you expressing yourself through the rule? And then on the other hand, like what is it enforcing you to do? Like, and kind of analysis from these kind of questions, or questions that come after those.
Oh yeah, actually, now that you say that, I come to think that it's actually just the way you put it, because kind of, let's say these rules create a space. Then it's a matter of, are you inside or outside the space? Because if they are very restricting, then you do not have any affordances that you have no possibilities of action, and then they kind of start suffocating you. But on the other hand, if you are outside that space that they create, let's say it's an object, and you can use that object, then it's just like if it's very restricting, it may also be very, very general, and you can use it to do whatever, if you can just like take it and use it like a hammer or something like that. But if you are inside the space, then you become the thing that gets hammered, and that's not nice.
Yeah, and you're actually hitting on another key point, another key element to add to this, which I think is equally important as the ones mentioned or ones we've been kind of playing around with, which is that rules essentially always create, you can think of it as parallel space, with space essentially. And the good example of this could be, there's, say, two kids, and one of them says, let's play cops and robbers. You're a cop, I'm a robber. So that in itself creates a parallel space, because now the same space they are, say, a living room, is slightly different. Like they are in the living room, but they are slightly in a different space because now the other one is a cop and a robber. It also creates another thing that is not really yet there and should be mentioned, a kind of potential breeding of other rules. And this goes to Linda's point of how this can evolve, because let's say these two kids start this like that the other says, okay, I'm the cop, you're the robber, fine. And then now they are in this parallel space, but it's almost like this construction yard. It's like they have to add more things to actually build that parallel space. But that just that moment of creating the rule, the first rule, like you're the cop, I'm the robber, creates another space. And it's another like inherent quality to these rules, which makes it interesting for many points that we have been exploring, and is a kind of complementary point to the earlier ones, I think.
I think there's also quite interesting thinking about rules that sort of purposefully disable people. So rules that are there not to be sort of, purposefully to cut out sort of a piece of the cake or whatever. So, yes, even more than restrictive, that are there, and by being there, they really sort of do not guarantee access to a lots of people because of the way in which they are designed and because of the fact that they are there. So enabling, but also disabling because the rule is there, basically. And also about when does a rule become law? And is it, I guess that goes back to the sort of decision of the rule / law.
Yeah, like it's an important area. Like I think like maybe a culture could be another good word rather than an ecosystem of this sort of like all these concepts that take up different emphasis of rules, like the law, for example, and that it's the same patterns. They do these same things, but then they emphasize something else. And I think in law, it's this sort of enforcement aspect. I would still say that even like the most restrictive of rules still have a component of enabling. It's like, let's say somebody's put in jail, like, but per the rule of they have some crime, and then there's rules of the court, and then the court by those rules puts a sentence, and so on. They're taken to jail. What is enabled as an experience? It's not the enablement that the person wants, most likely, but it is like an experience they otherwise wouldn't have. Like, and this, maybe there is a better word than enablement in it, but I think it's important to see this, like that they, well, it's also like towards this, that all the rules open new space. Like now there is a space of this person in jail, which is an experience that otherwise would not exist. So a new space is created again, even by this imprisonment. So it's not then, like, even this limiting, enabling, it's not positive negative thing. It's not like one is always positive and one is always negative. In a way, enablement can have certainly a negative feel if it's an enablement that you don't want, like an enablement of having the experience of being in jail. That's important, and maybe that's another thing to put on notes, to note that none of these are positive and negative, but inherently. But yeah.
This is really interesting, and like what you, Pekka, said, that okay, the experience and of course your focus also like changes within the new space, but like that you could also say that rules, even if at some general level they are meant to kind of level the playing field, play field. At the same time, they also seem, at least some rules also seem to have a potential for diversification, and this is of course probably bound to okay, let's say in Cup and Robbers, you are tied to your body and your senses and your imagination and so on, and probably how can you bring new kind of affordances, new possibilities, new roles, or kind of fragments of roles or something that you can start using in that space in order to kind of use those rules better, how you can design in that space.
Yeah, that is extremely important, and that also kind of allows to bridge in, I promised the last for now point on rules, and it's an equally important than the earlier ones. And this is like that rules always generate a discourse. And that is like, it's actually nicely coded in this pair of concepts that it's in English, but not in many other languages, which is game and play. And that, and I kind of had an interesting conversation with mostly French people who have jeu and jeu, like the same concept for both. And what was super interesting was that this difference was something that they didn't quite have. And they had kind of like made some other concepts that to try to replace it, even when they were writing in English. But when you explained that, okay, this is kind of the conceptual difference underneath, and they understood this. But you can think of it in this way, like, if you create a game structure, which is rules, and it's a kind of like a expression that allows to understand this, like we can cohere on our actions and behave by these rules. So that's the game. But then actually playing is a process. That's actually kind of engaging those rules, and it's something else than the rules. It's something else than the game. It's playing with the game, but it's almost not even playing within the game. Like because the game is almost like alien to it. Like if you have chess rules, they are separate from the chess to play. And the funny thing is, like, one of the sort of concepts on that was important in the early 20th century for the birth of semiotics. I mean, there were different birthing points. It started earlier in some other places, but one of the key contributors was Saussure. And Saussure, one of his structures he put to language was the division between langue and parole. Excuse my French, it's awful, I know. But it was this exactly same difference, that langue is the formality of language. It's not necessarily grammar, it's not only the rules, but it's kind of like this word is this word, like this is how it looks. But then even the meaning of that word is more in the parole, the kind of actual talking, using the language. And you always have to think the language as kind of playing between the langue and the parole. And that's how language is created. And trying to put them in the same creates problematic understanding, and thinking of them as kind of these very different operators is important. So like this, of course, connects to that the rules create new space, and that new space starts to generate all new rules. That comes through the play, that comes through this process of playing with the rules. Like, okay, you're the cop and I'm the robber, but okay, maybe that's your police headquarters then. Like, okay, now we can, but then that is just to enable the play and make the play more interesting. And the play kind of bounces off from the rules. That the rules are like this bouncing board, and allow to create direction for the play, but the play bounces off from them and creates its own discourse.
I mean, it's funny because I keep thinking, obviously, from my background, being sort of like a fan of the avant-garde of the 70s. So, you know, Fluxus, but then also a little bit Dada. They all had instructions, like they all had scores of, you know, the games. They had games and they had instructions. and going through archives, it seems as well quite programmatic, the way in which these rules were set. So yeah, I don't know, yeah, I just keep thinking about as well the language of how important is the language in making these rules or instructions, or I think it's pretty much everything, isn't it? Because that's how you then determine the rule. That's the language is everything, really.
I think it's a good kind of crystallization point, but then if we look at this sort of family of rules that, in a way, like if it's say a video game and it has this like this landscape, and you cannot walk through a hill or it's a steep hill, it kind of behaves like a rule, and it utilizes the messaging or meaning of a hill in a real world, but it's even more rule-like than the hill in a real world, because the game designer designs it precisely to the angle that it means that you cannot get through. So it's rule-like. But I do think like language is a good starting point to start thinking about it, because most of these forms happen in language, but then there are forms that kind of take these other mediums, so to speak. Or you can draw a picture and say that the picture is like you have to copy this picture. That is a rule, and then the picture is part of the rules in and of themselves. Like all of that is a possibility as well.
The example of the hill is almost like an unsaid, it's an unspoken rule. Sort of like, it's there by default. It's almost like an algorithmic rule. It has been coded, but it's not said. So just by trying to get there, then you realize the impossibility of getting there.
Yeah, and it's also like your point on Dadaist, etc. I think there was an interesting highlight there, because like looking at rules this way is also kind of like rules that are more internal, and that's something that is kind of addressed in the roles. But you can think of it this way, like if like a Dadaist performance where somebody will say unintelligible words for hours, which is a Tristan Sarat did that. But that kind of has an internal rule for him, that he made a rule for himself that I will avoid every word that would be a normal word. And he came there and was performing a rule, internal rules, yes, but very much rules. And actually those rules enabled the performance, or they were a key part of it, that he made the rules for himself to create that performance. And then if you start going through Dada or similar cultures, whatever vorticism, you kind of find these kind of rules everywhere. And so it's like underneath here, like if you put all of these things together and all of the other things that we have been talking about, you actually have a very different kind of paradigm of where rules are and how they behave. I would wish almost that there would be another concept that one could use here, but I haven't found a better one that would kind of say rules in their fully blooded form, but also kind of make people think about, like, now I have to think about them differently. But I still think it's a key story to tell for people and to kind of prepare them to understand this kind of design in itself.
Just to say, I have to leave in, let's say, 2 minutes, but I've really been enjoying this session. It's been so inspiring, and it's great to see so many people here, and looking forward to see you next time.
We could do a quick greatest hits, because while this is a very fertile conversation, just to insert like a quick a fast forward, like to point out some of the other things that are like key points that come from here to give some sense to it. So the one addition to this, okay, if we have this set of rules, but then we think of them as these actualities, like they are the forms that are there. Then what we have spoken as rights, but also moves and capabilities and skills and things like this. they can be thought of like, yes, rule-like forms, because right is like an expression of a rule, but what it tries to codify is this potentiality. Because right to free speech is not what you're actually necessarily doing, it's something that you're carrying with you as like, this is what I can do. And same in games, that like you could move there, is in the same position. And then, like, if you look at organizations, well, you have a right to proposal, to make a proposal in an organization. It is rule-like design, but in terms of this sort of, now we're designing potential that you're carrying. And why it's key is because a system that has actualities, like things that are there right now, like the hill that you're facing, or like, and it also has potentialities, like you can do this even if you're not doing it now. That is a dynamic system. That's a system that has its own life. It will always change. And like the potentialities are the root that new things are introduced there, like new proposal or new action by a player or the character. But it kind of like gives both the kind of framework to think about them. So that's one thing. But then fast forwarding, this creates several interesting things that could be said about roles. Maybe we'll skip over that for now, and we can return to that at any point. But the one thing I wanted to point out as a whole longer conversation, that we've been talking about this sort of structure of a world that is kind of like the metaverse, but in a way it's larger, and in connection to it is sort of capturing and saving. And what if we think of saving in a much more wider fashion? Like you could save any state, and how do you save it? And the save being kind of like even metaphorical and things like this. That actually there is an interesting build-up from all of this to the point of how to think about this kind of structure, this sort of possible realms or semi-verse. Like if you create something to play, but that thing that is you can play, like let's say it's a tavern or a shop in a world. I'm using RPG examples because they are maybe easiest way to explain it. And you have just written up this tavern. And in a way, these are rules, that these are actualities. There also might be potentialities, like there is, I don't know, a hat you can buy from the store. But in, like, if this exists in this sort of game world, people could visit that store, and somebody might buy a hat, and some other group might visit it, and they might buy the same hat. They exist in their own, they create branching timelines. They can also decide that it's interesting to visit that shop after some other group has gone to it. And maybe they find that actually that other group burned the store down. And then they're kind of syncing in the same world, but they also might decide that that's actually boring and go to the store before it happens. Or somebody might say, hey, that's an interesting store. I like it that it's in this city and in this world we are all playing, but I don't like the storekeeper. I will change it into this grumpy dwarf. And now they have a variant that is not in time or process, but in a kind of whole another kind of a branch. Or somebody says, hey, I like the store, but I don't like that it's in this city. But I'm still using the same derivative world, but I'm placing the store into this city. So it's another variant again. But through all of that huge amount of variants, there is actually a common structure, which is that all of these things that are formed by these rules and rights, these actualities and potentialities, they simply form these states of expression. It's like a mini game to play, a state of game to play. And then it just matters how you engage with it, or even if you modify it, you can actually come to this kind of richness. And that's much more than, say, metaverse, certainly more than Facebook metaverse, but it's even more than the kind of theoretical metaverse that people have been thinking about. But it's very structured in itself. Okay, that's the fast forward. There's other things, but all of that, like the final kind of summary, all of that actually start like what we thought of for these paradigms, that it would kind of create this, okay, why there is a necessity for looking at things differently in order to see games organizations and economies together. but it's also opening up that, hey, actually from that opens up a lot of, not just that possibility of looking at them together, but opening up towards a very different perspective towards all of them, and even the kind of forms that we put experiences, whether it's internet or metaverse or etc., how those can be playful as well and have organizational principles alongside or along the lines of these ones.
I think this is massively interesting because really that you can have this sort of like elastic and plastic attitude towards both time and timelines and
Yeah.
spaces and rewriting and re-experiencing them. So I really look forward to seeing the recording and especially continuing from here.
Yeah, and yeah, I would say, like, if we have this, then we have the game forms as examples how to play, and we have these instruments. It, like, we can talk about what everybody's interest in, like, should we create it and which kind of form. I think there's a lot of support that it's playable ultimately, and I think it certainly can be, but and should be maybe, but it's already quite a lot that XORG could say if we wanted to say this kind of reconceiving of actually quite many things, and with quite a lot of implications. Any comments other Rock, Pablo? I've been trying to multitask on the.
I got really excited with my diagram.
That's good.
Yeah, there's maybe it's a bit far-fetched having both time and entropy in the same diagram as role-playing games and language, but there's some interesting things emerging there. Maybe we we could work more on it.
Sounds very logical to me, actually. but and that's actually something like it's almost like the reason I thought role-playing games as the first example was that was a kind of the way to think about those kind of structures, talking about this sort of possible realms. So having time and entropy and role-playing games, like especially how they conceive the world and how it operates, including time and space, is a really interesting combination between structurality and playfulness and kind of fictionality or all together.
Yeah. And just now, I mean, I see this emerging right now from the diagram. There's like this tendency towards very simple but very strict rules to be very enabling, sort of like protocols, right? Very low level, super strict, but very simple, sort of are the most enabling. And as things go up in that stack, I guess they become, I don't know, I'm still just trying to understand this. Maybe there's some thoughts around that. The strictness has to be paired with simplicity for them to be enabling. Otherwise, if they're strict and convoluted, we again end up in bureaucracy.
Yeah. I think that's definitely a worthwhile direction. And it includes this overhead, which is like, who is processing the rules, who has to keep them in their head. Like for example, if you would put a computer game amount of rules into a human's head, the killer would be the overhead. Like how much you have to think in itself. And it's like it's a separate factor, but it's a affecting factor as well. But I do think the thing you're thinking is also definitely a factor there.
Yeah, and also it's like it's a rule that, as you said, a protocol, so it can be swiftly operated through, just choice, or is it a rule sort of that is strict and needs consultation? It needs sort of like meeting up and more sort of other forms of more bureaucracy, and that's also time, because it can be instant, the protocols one, you choose and you decide and you make a choice, but then others can be very lengthy and draining as well. So what if you automate those instead, which I don't think is the answer necessarily, especially for complex sort of rules or decision.
Yeah, it's also like this actually made me think of something I haven't really thought, but it's actually probably important, that there is a kind of balancing between overhead and opaqueness, which is that on the other hand, if you put too many rules for a human to process, this is known in role-playing game circles, for example, and board game circles also, is that too many rules is a problem of its own. That's the overhead. But the opaqueness is that, okay, you have these complex rules of, say, a computer game, but even though the computer can run them, but they're kind of opaque because computer knows them, but you don't know them. So you don't actually know what you can do. And it's a different kind of problem, but very much a related problem. So it's this sort of like a two like side limiting factors that are always good to think about. On the other hand, overhead, how many rules you have to think, and opaqueness is how the running of the rules can make actually it non-understandable for the player. Like the rules work. The computer knows the rules. They're running without fault, but the player actually doesn't know the rules, what they're playing with. But Rock, I wanted to ask you, like, hopefully it's been at least somewhat interesting, or I'm nudging you to comment on whatever your thoughts are.
Yes, of course. Yeah, you mentioned multitasking. I'm also kind of, well, I'm guilty on another front. Like, still have a few hours of translation ahead of me today, and a few other small tasks. So I've been, yeah, listening in while doing some stuff. And with that, I guess maybe also an idea maybe to contribute came up in terms of like spectator of games and how that fits into the picture, or you know, spectator participant as well as lurker and other things like that.
That is a topic that actually probably should be included. I have a bunch on this, but I'll just be short. One key thought for me is that the player is always a spectator, even the most active player. Is that, like, let's take chess. I mean, that's not the most active player picture, but it's a good, like, you are playing when you're watching the board, and it is kind of spectating even if you're thinking about your next move. And similarly, if it's a super action video game, you're looking at other players, and it's quite natural that among that you might think of, oh, that's a good move, or that's nicely done by the player, which is a normal spectator thought in a way. But it comes in that mode because you always are spectating while operating, like, and you're mixing up this sort of. I once had this game which was called like author, actor, spectator, and the game was like that you had to raise one finger if you were authoring, like thinking like what you want to express, like what kind of things, new things you would do. Actor would be the one who thinks about how they are expressing things, like, okay, that was slightly wrong inflections of voice, but also would be a player thinking like, oh, I should have moved that better, and so on. And then the spectator being like the one who is kind of observing the situation and reading, like in the sense of reading. And why I made that game was that when people played, they noticed that they are constantly changing the fingers. This was in a normal situation, like people drinking coffee and eating. Like it keeps on changing and flickering, and you often have two of them on, like not just one. Like I'm actually spectating and being an author because I'm listening what you're saying, but I'm thinking of what I'm going to say, and that's very much an author thing. And then I'm actor author because I'm thinking about how I'm saying the words, but I'm also thinking the words I'm saying in the future. And that was to kind of like to make this sort of exercise that makes understandable there's how these forms naturally are actually intertwined. And this is of course true. I could do it inside the game and the same thing would happen. And maybe that is a good point to add there. That it's a actually there is no playing without spectatorship in a way. Of course, you can be like a lurker, like only spectator as well, but no player is not a spectator in some level. But that's another useful addition, I think. But what do you think, like if we're kind of arriving to towards the end and time is running, I will first apologize because this is precisely what the one thing I was worried that because it's like I've been traveling for nearly 3 weeks and then there's like all these new thoughts and I'm at the airport, it comes a little bit like a torrent of things and I talk too much again. But I at least like to a minor extent managed to open the conversation because like it should have been more of a conversation, but because your thoughts are really good. So this conversation is extremely fertile. But while apologizing for being slightly too torrentous and too much word spillage, but if you look at it as a whole and this as connected to this direction we've been thinking about, that the like in a way premising how to think about this, the sort of combination of organizations, games, and economies, like, and how to think about, even if you're playing one of our forms or playing with it, like what would be a good kind of like a mindset to approach them. Like, does this seem to be going in a good direction, or yeah, or is there things that definitely should be added? That's probably a longer conversation, but any impressions or any last comments?
I would just be curious to know or to maybe think of a plan on how to move in small steps towards building the game of organizations of games, of playable games of organizations, like how to make it happen. I'm just like, it feels so abstract, then it feels so tangible, and then I lose it. It's just like an amorphous thing.
I think in a way, if we think of like this paradigms part as like preparatory material, and in some ways it's not even like required. It's not like you have to like read and process, say, all of these concepts before you play, but it's almost like can wait there. You can start from there or not. Then secondly, that you can kind of make these parts somewhat modular. Like you can talk about the rules in modularly from, say, this sort of possible realms approach, so on and so forth. What this part might contribute is, like, let's say the bullet points for the chapter headings, roughly speaking, for the paradigms part, and how they kind of connect together, which then could feed as a kind of ways to look at or ways to play with the compositions, whether OBOK or ArcOrg or the genes, or how to play with the generators in and of themselves. So, like, in a way, I think like detailing down how these paradigms could be, or what aspects should be described there. Maybe this was essentially works towards that, which can serve the whole as its own part. That's at least how I see it. But uh, uh, does it work for you, Pablo? That perspective towards it?
Yes, absolutely.
So yeah, working in a particular area, and also like how to go from just writing rules or rights to actually having an explanation of what they mean and how are they different, essentially that.
That's all really exciting.
But I think for the upcoming future, once I get home and once I get out of this constant running around like a electrified bunny of some sort, or headless chicken, pick your mental image, and I also will be more or less like an electrified bunny, but yeah, like for that kind of framing for me was the kind of way I thought about this. Like it was like one of the problems to solve for this game of games. Maybe not the kind of most central, but I would say still like essential, was this like how to tell these things, which we have been using. I think like these things, even though they introduced new things, they were more tracing of what we have been doing. And like we have actually operated in the limiting enabling kind of understanding or intuition, at least, I think. And we have been certainly operating in like looking at the rules and discourses as their own things. Like there's a rule set and then there's a discourse upon them, they might change rules. So in a way, like this might be a way to walk somebody through that. Like walking through an explanation in a way, which you cannot do by simply saying a word like rules in itself. So in that sense, I think it's essential. Microgames, yes, that could be a good challenge, reacting to your comment, Pablo. But I do think it would be a good direction to work towards, like, and maybe the next challenge would be to play these things or create even the microgame examples, playable examples, and actually play them.
Sounds good. And to me, I will come now every sort of Friday because I don't work anymore sort of on that day. So I would love to be involved more.
That would be great. This is always good that somebody gets unshackled from the work and we could lure a person here. And I think like I would kind of put the challenge of actually next time more playing. I don't know, how's your feeling? I would imagine that Pablo, you would be for it, but yes. But maybe playing towards like taking this whole metagame of games, or call it whatever, playable toolkit towards realization, because I think it's definitely possible and a key part of it in order that it's playable. All right, Mario Party. Okay, we'll have challenges, but let's work towards that, and I'll put some of the writers' links I mentioned to the Telegram, and also I've been thinking of we could finally put together the Discord if we want. I've been playing around with Discord, so that's a more playful environment. So that's another thing that might be visited next week.
That would be very exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's get on that. All right.
Yeah. And if any of you want to move stuff around in my diagram, that would be great, so that it's not only me, but that we collectively decide where to put things. I'm not sure of them. That would be nice.
Yeah, one can move stuff and even make comments or create a parallel
or
diagram.
add new ones, or
Yeah.
add like an alternative version of it. I think we would need more than one to describe rules with more axes to compare. That would be interesting.
But yeah, I think you were already kind of getting to this sort of opening of like looking at the rules this way opens up so many possibilities, even towards large questions like entropy. So I'll promise to play around with it. Let's put it that way. All right. Anyway, from my side, sorry for the airport and the background noise. I thank you for a really good conversation and really good points and additions. Feel free to add to the thing. Sometimes if you feel like I don't want to add there, even make a copy. Like sometimes I feel better like to make a copy of somebody's thing, and that kind of frees up some thinking, because the kind of mirror board is an infinite space, and I will remember to give you, Linda, the editing rights. I just have to put your email there, and if that's forgotten, pester me about it.
Yeah, I will.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and lovely to meet you all.
Yeah,
And
thank
good
you.
that you're here.
Have a safe trip, Pekko.
I will try. Let's see how it turns out. But I'm hoping it's also interesting, but not too interesting.
And see you all soon.
Yeah.
See you. And now I will press stop recording once I find it in this stupid interface. Yes, here it is.